Hello and welcome to this short series of videos about Jane Austen's novel Emma. By the time Jane Austen was writing Emma, she had 4 full-length novels behind her. Northanger Abbey had not yet been published, although it was broadly written. She would edit it again considerably. But she had certainly published Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, which was a well-received novel at the time, although it tends to be Jane Austen's least popular novel in today's world. In writing Emma, Jane Austen, as I would argue that she does in all of her novels, has chosen an unconventional character for her heroine. She has gone so far outside of the realms of convention in Emma as to choose a heroine which, as Jane Austen herself wrote on the 21st of January 1814, I'm going to take a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. This is a very brave decision for any author to take. I think Jane Austen must have been really quite highly confident, even if a little ironically or satirically confident, of her abilities to pull this off in writing a novel. And I think without a shadow of a doubt, in Emma, Jane Austen arrives at her consummate power of producing the perfect, the complete, the in every way finished, highly polished, exuberant, flamboyant, creative masterpiece of the novel. It really is the archetypal perfect novel at this time, or at this point in the history of the novel, when Jane Austen was effectively creating the form of the modern novel. So, after that quite florid introduction, let's descend to some slightly more mundane details, publication details. The novel was begun in January 1814 and it was completed in March 1815. It was published in December of 1815, but the publication date is given as 1816 in the first edition. For this novel, Jane Austen moved from her publisher Egerton, with whom she'd been for her other novels, to John Murray of Albemarle Street, who would of course be one of the major publishers throughout the 19th century. The move may have been financially based. She may have believed that she could get a better deal for her work from John Murray. But it may also have been for reasons of prestige. She may have wished to be associated with a publisher who is regarded as being of higher calibre. In the event, John Murray offered to pay Jane Austen £450 for the copyright of Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park and Emma. This was quite an audacious offer financially, as Henry Austen, Jane Austen's brother, pointed out to the publisher. In the first edition of Mansfield Park alone, Jane Austen had earned more than £450 from sales. So Murray negotiated his offer, and it was settled that he would publish a first edition of Emma and a second edition of Sense and Sensibility on a profit-sharing basis. In Jane Austen's view of her new publisher, prestige or not, prestige or no, was that he is a rogue, of course, but a civil one. So, it was actually through this novel, well, not through this novel, but by this time, Jane Austen's anonymity as an author had been exploded. I think that probably really happened within the private social circles that her family mixed in by the time of writing Pride and Prejudice. But by the time of Emma appearing, it was really more broadly and widely known that Jane Austen was the author of these novels. Nevertheless, when Emma is published, it has the title line of Emma, a novel in 3 volumes by the author of Pride and Prejudice, etc., etc. I think that there was still some feeling of it not being quite socially acceptable to acknowledge such a public expression of thoughts and ideas, either at this level of society or because Jane Austen was a woman in this level of society, that a level of modesty, retirement, and sense of preserving one's privacy were expected to operate both within this class of the gentry, but most especially with regard to the social etiquette and behaviour of women within this social group. The first edition came out as 2,000 copies, and 1,200 of these were sold during the first year of publication, which was quite creditable. Unfortunately, at the same time, losses on a second edition of Mansfield Park, which was published on a profit-sharing basis, failed to meet expectations. Mansfield Park had sold well in the first edition, but the second edition didn't sell well. And as a result, the 2 novels of Mansfield Park being republished and Emma coming out, the sales figures sort of cancelled one another out. And Jane Austen herself only ever received £38.18 for the publication of this major work, which, when we think about how many copies have been sold during the 200 years since her death, and also a variety of television and film productions that have been made of the novel, is an extraordinarily poor income for her, the author, to have derived from the novel. It's staggering sometimes when considering how little money Jane Austen actually earned from her genius, how much money other people have managed to earn from it in the interim. This novel, unusually for Jane Austen's works, was most respectfully dedicated to His Royal Highness the Prince Regent by His Royal Highness's dutiful and obedient humble servant, the author. And the way in which this dedication came about is somewhat circuitous. Henry Austen, Jane Austen's brother, had fallen ill of a bilious attack on one occasion when she was visiting him in London. And the physician who attended Henry was a man called Charles Haydon, and he had an acquaintance with a physician to the Prince Regent. So Haydon informed Jane that the Prince was an admirer of her work, and actually had a set of her novels in all of his residences. And it seems that Haydon had passed on to his friend, physician, the fact that Jane Austen was in town, and she received an invitation to visit Carlton House, the home of the Prince Regent whilst in London, from his librarian, James Stainer Clark. And she visited, and there was a correspondence of some short duration between Jane Austen and James Stainer Clark, during the course of which it was intimated to Jane Austen that it would, be well received were she to dedicate a novel to the Prince Regent. There were various other suggestions about topics that she might take up involving members of royalty, but Jane declined all of those, and the only one that she acceded to was the dedication of the novel to the Prince Regent. So when a statement such as this was made, although it wasn't couched in the terms of being a command, it would usually have been interpreted as a royal command, and so Jane Austen has dedicated the novel to the Prince Regent. The novel Emma was generally well received, and it led to a flurry of literary acclaim for Jane Austen. Her novel was reviewed in the Quarterly Review in March 1816 by Sir Walter Scott, no less. The novel Emma appears, though, to have triggered a general review of all of Austen's published works up to this time, and Scott goes quite minutely into also a discussion of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice in the review. Actually, it's not quite true. He doesn't mention Mansfield Park, something which upset Jane Austen and about which she wrote to the editor of the Quarterly Review, asking whether it wouldn't be possible to include Mansfield Park and to review it too. However, that never actually seemed to happen. Presumably, Sir Walter Scott had not read Mansfield Park, and it is quite a longish novel, so I suppose if the review was stimulated by the publication of Emma and there was some urgency to actually get the review out, it wouldn't have been viable for Scott to additionally have read Mansfield Park at the time. Emma was also reviewed at the Edinburgh Review, which was an important and prestigious journal to be reviewed in at the period. Apparently, Mr. Jeffrey, the reviewer, admitted having been kept up for 3 nights in reading it. So, yes, although the plot is really very domestic and revolves around walks, short carriage drives, paying visits in the town, occasionally going shopping and carrying out acts of philanthropy, the cleverness of the psychological play between the characters and the fact that a number of the characters are to some extent leading a double life means that it is quite exciting. It's quite a dazzling little novel because there are so many little intrigues and carefully wrought deceptions being played on Emma, the protagonist, but also on the reader who sees so much of the story through Emma's eyes, that it although on the surface of it, it seems quite an innocuously plotted novel. In reality, beneath the surface, it's a highly intricately plotted novel and full of really highly detailed interest. So I can see really how, especially at the period when there would have been much less acquaintance with novels of this type, it could have kept someone up reading for 3 nights. It is a novel as well which I think at the time gave value for money. Novels were relatively expensive to buy at this time. Paper was still relatively expensive to produce. Printing methods hadn't taken on the advanced industrialization that they would manage in the mid-century. And so novels were relatively expensive to buy. People had library subscriptions to offset that, I think, often. But then one might have been waiting a while in order to be able to borrow a book like Emma when it first came out. And so in reading Emma, because Emma is so carefully plotted and there are so many tiny little subterfuges within the plot to mislead the reader about exactly what someone is saying doesn't always accord with exactly what they're doing and who they really are. So there are so many of these little subterfuges and little deceptions played by one character on the other that the novel bears reading quite a number of times in order to really be able to tease out every element of the puzzle that Jane Austen has set. And that must have been enjoyable and good as well for the whole way in which novels were read, which was often out loud in family or group settings. So even if an individual had read the novel before, they could enjoy listening to it again or reading it to others again, because there's so much to actually observe, there's so much interplay, that I think it bears reading probably at least 5 times in a relatively short space of time before you've probably teased and puzzled everything out from it. Jane Austen sent a copy of this novel to her authoress heroine, Mariah Edgeworth. And it's really quite a statement on Jane Austen's part that she, in writing Emma, thinks that it's good enough. She's arrived at a standard that she can feel ready to approach, her leading light as a female writer. Mariah Edgeworth appears to have been very little impressed by the novel. The admiration is by no manner of means mutual. Mariah Edgeworth wrote in a letter to a friend, I'm not sure to whom actually, there was no story in it except that Miss Emma found that the man whom she designed for Harriet's lover was an admirer of her own, and he was affronted by being refused by Emma, and Harriet wore the willow. And smooth, thin water gruel is, according to Emma's father's opinions, a very good thing, and it is very difficult to make a cook understand what you mean by smooth, thin water gruel. I think which comment on the novel Emma says a lot more about Mariah Edgeworth than it does about the novel. It's a really poor commentary on the novel actually, and would appear a little bit to carry more than a nuance, I think, of jealousy at Jane Austen's skill, who was ultimately a better writer than Mariah Edgeworth. Around the same time, Jane Austen wrote to her niece Anna, though, I have made up my mind to like no novels really, but Miss Edgeworth's, yours and my own. And that was in 1814. When it comes to genre, I think that we could classify Emma as a romantic comedy. There is an omniscient third-person narrator who remains anonymous, and who does not either give away the plot as we go along, nor even intimate or hint in the way that one might find in a Dickens novel, at the idea that things are not as they seem, nor engage in that Gothic style which Dickens also frequently used, of narrating something in a way that suggests that destiny will carry something different through than what appears to be the case at present. So the narrator, the omniscient narrator in Emma, remains very neutral, but is nonetheless present. There is a considerable portion of the story is told in this style of free, indirect discourse, which revolves, of course, around or comes through the protagonist, Emma. And this is the narrative form which Jane Austen in particular developed, in which the character's own thoughts and ideas are delivered as narrative. So we see the story, we see the unfolding of the story as the reader through the eyes of the character whose consciousness is being unfolded as narrative. But this is not the ultimate narrator, the omniscient narrator. That's a different voice within the novel, and neither voice, of course, is necessarily that of the author. An author may choose to characterize the omniscient narrator as quite a different individual from themselves, and as they enter into the free indirect discourse with any one of their characters in this novel, in particular through Emma, then again, it's not necessarily the author, it's the character who's seeing things unfold in this way. It's particularly significant in this novel because Emma is so blind to the actual intentions, the actual motives, the actual situations and positions of the majority of the people by whom she is surrounded. Now, true situations and circumstances always come to her as a bit of a shock, really. What's interesting, and what perhaps makes Emma ultimately not a dislikable heroine for the reader, although Jane Austen has set out to create a heroine whom nobody will like, is the fact that Emma doesn't know herself either. Emma is ultimately, at the end of the novel, surprised by herself and how she really feels and thinks. So the reader is of course able to forgive Emma for many of her socially quite arrogant positions that she has held during the course of the novel. She has also engaged in some behaviour which is highly doubtful and somewhat spiteful towards Jane Fairfax. And it's difficult at all times in the novel to like Emma, but equally when we realise at the end of the novel that Emma is blind to who she is and how she feels even in her better self, I think it's understandable, because probably most of us have been there ourselves, at least to some extent. The style of writing in Emma is a mixture of irony, satire, and sympathy. There are some moments of outright humour. I think it's certainly possible to find oneself laughing, outright at some sentences and lines in Emma. And of course, there are points in which, as the reader, one is slightly ahead of what's happening, and can chuckle as well at the way in which the plot's unfolding and the blindness of the characters. In that way as well, it's a little play-like. And there's always, I think, in Jane Austen's novels, a way in which the novel presents itself somewhat like a play, somewhat like an entirely contained world, and set on a stage. The characters, although there's strong effort psychologically and conversationally to make the characters highly realistic, if not naturalistic, nevertheless, the way in which the stories are set up and the plots are set up, there is an element of staging, and as if it could be a comedy play. And that's of course one of the reasons why Jane Austen is so easily dramatised, and why it can be so well dramatised, so enjoyably dramatised. The plot, despite a lot of irony and satire, is written sympathetically. I think that we develop quite a lot of sympathy for the different characters. For Harriet, who's not particularly bright and who's quite considerably manipulated during the course of the story. For Jane Fairfax, whose situation is a very delicate and difficult one, as she hovers on the edge of remaining middle class, on the edge of being able to remain respectable. And Emma makes her position more precarious, and this is one of the ways in which Emma is dislikable. We feel sympathy for Miss Bates, because although in many ways she's quite a tiresome character and talks and talks and talks, and as readers we have to read and read and read all her many, many words, nevertheless it's difficult not to feel sympathy for the good-natured and enduring and long-suffering Miss Bates, because her situation in life is one in which she finds herself trapped. For Emma too, as I've already discussed, we gradually build up and feel a level of sympathy. For the male characters, I think there's less of a build-up of sympathy. I'm not sure how much sympathy we feel for Mr. Woodhouse, Emma's father, in the novel. I'm not sure how much sympathy we feel for Frank Churchill. We may come to like Mr. Knightley well enough. The Mr. Weston, sorry, who lives at Randalls. Yes. But again, I think with all of the men, there's a little bit of a question mark sometimes. How well they have fulfilled their roles as men, how well they live up to the status and power that at this level of society, the gentry level of society, is automatically accorded them. How well do they really fulfill that status? There is a question mark over all of the men with regard to that. Dramatic irony is very cleverly set up in this novel. Dramatic irony is really where the reader expects one thing to happen and is led towards thinking that one thing will happen, and then something else unexpectedly happens, and the reader is sort of thrown on their head, and everything that's passed before is set into a position of irony. But there's also dramatic irony where the reader knows that something's not the case and is following the characters in the plot, thinking that something is the case, whereas the reader knows it isn't, and then enjoying watching what happens, the denouement of those situations. And that occurs frequently in this novel, and it's a big part of course, rereading the novel and the entertainment of rereading the novel, because it is so tightly and minutely plotted and detailed through the consummate skill of the use of language by the author. There's the fun of plotting the little clues that the author leaves throughout the text. Emma observes many of these cues, but of course she tends to misinterpret them all the time, which creates a lot of hilarity.